Welcome back. It's with great pleasure that I introduce from University of Manchester, Albena Yaneva. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm very excited about the discussions we can have during these 2 days. I will talk about the secret life of buildings from a slightly different perspective than that Jorge talked in the previous lecture. I'm trained as an anthropologist, and my interest in architectural practices, in the secret life of buildings, foam models, and other contested things in architecture began in 2001 when I started working at the Office of Metropolitan Architecture, OMA, the office of Rem Koolhaas in Rotterdam, as an anthropologist / sociologist coming from the school of Bruno Latour. Rem guided me in the office this very first day. It was November 2001, and the very first thing I saw on that day was this table of models. This is the project for the extension of the Whitney Museum of American Art. The project was at that time in the office of Koolhaas, and this was a politically important project for him. So we touring the office, and we stopped next to this table, and Rem says, "This is the table of democracy." This, it took me some time to understand what he meant and how a table of scale models, different type of scale models, as you can see, can be a table of democracy. The project, as I said, was extremely important for him at the time because he was dreaming to build in delirious New York. Later, I found out that the table of models does not just contain different type of models, a site model, a programmatic model, a circulation model, which you can immediately recognize, OMA's signature here with the red escalators. But this table also contained scenarios for the future development of the building and bits of history, traces of past controversies surrounding that building. Thus, I have spent 2 years in this office, just like an anthropologist will spend 2 years living on an island. Say Malinowski spent more than 2 years living on a Trobriand islands, trying to understand the culture and the language of a specific tribe. My tribe, in this particular case, were the architects from OMA, and it took me, indeed, 2 years to get to understand their language, to get to speak their language, and to get to understand the culture they shared, and the production of knowledge, and how the production of architectural knowledge specific to this office contributed to their rituals and culture. On that first day, when I saw the table of models, we discussed my project with Rem, and he said, "Do you want to be the invisible person in the office? At OMA, how would you like to observe us? How would you like to observe our work? Would you need a room full of cameras so you can do so?" And I was extremely embarrassed by this question because he tried to translate immediately my intention to do an ethnographic observation in the office and the everyday practices of the architects into architectural terms. He tried to architecture my presence in the OMA from the very start. Of course, it was a joke, a Foucauldian one for me, because I just imagined, just for a second, the panopticon horror of sitting in a room, in an office full of screens and monitors, and overseeing the architectural practices at OMA. And it's not what I wanted to do. My intention was not to oversee the process of design so as to grasp the general rules of design or grapple the genuine OMA habits. I just wanted to be able to see the details of their day-to-day activities. I wanted to watch architects draw and handle models. I wanted to see the table of models and to understand what kind of cognitive assemblage is this table. I wanted to witness the distributed knowledge in the architectural practice. I wanted also to watch the ordinary places and to see the ordinary places of design, to witness this messiness of models and other secret hidden objects that take part in the architectural project, but we never show them and never take picture of these objects. I wanted to watch the architects draw and handle models, dialogue with models, cut foam and interact with this very versatile fabric of the foam, as most of the models in this office are made of foam, and there's experimental working models. I also wanted to see the architects, witness their daily life. I wanted to see them smoke and discuss the latest development on a project, to feel the pressure in the air when the tall silhouette of Rem appears in the office, and to see all the tiny fragments from the daily routines, and to be part of this daily practice. And that is what I did. I worked on a number of projects, not just the Whitney, which was my main project at the start, but I also happened to take part in some discussions on the Seattle Public Library, which you see here, on the Porto building and some samples that were taken at the time. The CCTV building was in the office, and then the crowd got bigger as the design progressed, because at the start there were some 70, 80 architects working in the practice, and towards the end of my observation, perhaps more than 150 architects working on different projects. I was very intrigued by the model as a very specific being, as a specific feature, as a specific creature in this office, and the active participation of models in design thinking, and not just as final models, but as working models that help the architects to generate knowledge about different projects and different buildings. So I spent these 2 years in ethnographic observation, trying to capture the rhythm of design, and I used various techniques of observation, which allowed me to stay at 2 different distances from design process, close to the actors and the course of their action, intervening, interacting with them, participating, even cutting foam from time to time, pretending I'm helping, and also at a greater distance from this process, so as to be able to translate and inscribe traces of action and speech acts after I have been part of a discussion on a building. This kind of double distance of the anthropologist helped me to also get accepted by the designers as part of the office routines. For many historians and theorists of architecture who had the chance to interview Koolhaas and spend time in his practice, lingering more than a day in the practice is a waste of time. And they were telling me, yeah, don't waste your time, just do a long interview with the big star and go. So for them to explain Koolhaas's design and his approach, or a project like the new Whitney, it will suffice to refer to the larger theoretical influences upon his design. For instance, the impact of surrealism or on his early works, or the influence of the modern movement, or his rapport with functionalism, or the theoretical influence of Mies van der Rohe, or Le Corbusier, or Russian constructivism. Another storyline would be to follow his background as a journalist for the Hagische Post and screenwriter, his childhood in Indonesia, and all these factors, this background, Indonesia, and all these factors will explain us his distinctive architectural approach. His fascination by Manhattan, for instance, and his theory of the skyscraper, of density and congestion, will be explained by his Dutchness and the fact that the first settlers of Manhattan were Dutch, recreating their land with nostalgia. And the list of interpretations can be continued. They all revolved around those lines. What's in the head of the architect, or what's behind his buildings? I find it somehow surprising to see architectural theorists desperately trying to understand Koolhaas's style, idiosyncrasies, and strengths by simply referring to his singularity and individuality as a creator, as if we were to judge him as a 17th century unique genius, or, on the other side, factors outside the realm of architecture, society, culture, class, gender. Why is it that theorists of architecture are more interested in his big ideas, in the leaps of imagination, in the powerful insights, leaving often design experience apart and even excluding his office practice as being significant for the understanding of his buildings? Why is it that realistic accounts of the contemporary architectural practices of the design worlds are missing? Why is it that in the prevailing analysis, buildings are interpreted as separated from both the conditions of their making and the design experience of the makers? These were my questions from the start. A different way to look at the architecture of Ram Koolhaas, different from the picture that symbolizes this traditional approaches, is to look at the practice and the objects and their trajectories and how they circulate in the office. A pragmatist perspective that would aim at understanding the practices rather than the theories and the ideologies, the actions rather than the discourses, architecture in the making rather than architecture made. And that is the reason why I engaged in ethnography of design, by slowing down and trying to capture the complexity of design and trying to account for the many different participants in design process, rather than just interviewing the star architect. I follow designers at work, just like the sociologist of science Bruno Latour did in the 70s, following scientists at work to understand the production of scientific facts. So to understand the meaning of OMA's buildings and Koolhaas's architecture, I needed to forget or put on hold the official interpretations and to look instead at the ordinary conditions of experience, to follow the way architects make sense of their world-building activities, to look at the routines, the experimentation with models, the mistakes, and the workaday choices, to look at the collective activities of both architects and other participants in design, humans and models, paints and pixels, material samples and plans that all constitute the design world. I assumed design was accountable, that is, pragmatically knowable, not symbolic. The particular case I started exploring, this was the first project I worked on, was the new Whitney. This particular building entered the office of Koolhaas in 2001, but the building itself has a long history. The building was designed, and you probably all know the museum, this is a small museum on Madison Avenue, between the 75th and 74th Street, a museum for living American artists. It was designed in the 60s by the Bauhaus-trained architect Marcel Breuer, together with Hamilton Smith, and was built in 1966. The building, already at the very start, was extremely controversial. It was largely discussed on the pages of various newspapers and art journals in the 60s. Many different critiques came from different sides, from architectural critics, from the museum world, from museum professionals, from architects, and from ordinary New Yorkers and neighbors of the museum. And they were all concerned by the design and disliked it. Nevertheless, the building was built. They all, in a way, gathered around the scaffolding of the building during its construction and discussed the design. And already there, the building was very active in terms of provoking those discussions, in terms of triggering disputes. The protagonists in this controversy were concerned by two aspects of the building in particular: its upside-down structure, so it looked like an inverted pyramid, or in a way an inverted New York, but because most of the buildings in New York have the opposite shape. And it was a windowless building. It has this windowless character, was quite disturbing at the same time. The building had only two buildings, only two windows. The window we see here, and there's another window on the east side. So the building was hated and debated for a number of years during the design and construction. And once it was built in 1966, it became a beloved modernist icon. In the 1980s, the museum, the board of the trustees of the museum and the museum director decided there was already a need for extension, and another American architect, Michael Graves, was commissioned to design an extension of the Whitney. He suggested to demolish the existing brownstones. There are brownstones next to the Breuer building, and a huge concrete wall separates the Breuer building from these brownstones. They're from the beginning of the century, and they're protected buildings. Nevertheless, Graves decided to demolish the brownstones, and he suggested also to build a replica of the Breuer building next to the Breuer, and a third structure, a huge structure overarching the two buildings. The style is distinctively postmodern. There were three different schemes developed, one in 1982, another one in 1987, and the third one in 1989. Every time Graves presented a scheme, it was extremely controversial. The public didn't like it. The museum professionals were always divided. Preservationists and modernists debated the building, and Graves had to go back to the drawing board and rethink, rescale, scale down, tone down the stylistic features of the building, and then get another proposal. It was a decade of controversies between modernists and postmodernists. One of the biggest battles in the galaxy of architecture. These controversies enrolled a large number of actors as well, and triggered a lot of disagreements and reactions among museum professionals and modernists and postmodernists. The museum professionals were split into two parts: those who were for the extension of Graves and those who were against the extension. Modernists, of course, endorsed. Modernists were against the proposal of Michael Graves because of the brutal relationship to the Breuer and because of the decision to demolish the brownstones. A huge debate which ended without the results, because at the end of this decade of this aesthetic battle, the building was still not extended. In 2001, the same building entered the office of Koolhaas, and Koolhaas was commissioned the extension of the Whitney Museum of American Art. So his decision was not to demolish the brownstones, to keep the brownstones, and to build a third part which will connect the existing Breuer building and the brownstones in a new way. So in a way we see a new concept of architecture of addition here. We don't just have an old building and a new part, so the new attached to the old. So Koolhaas overcomes this dichotomy of architecture of addition, new and old, but entirely rethinks the dichotomy by integrating the existing brownstones, refurbishing and integrating the existing brownstones and making them part of this ensemble of three, and adding the third part, which almost serves like a connecting mechanism between the Breuer building, the brownstones, and the modern part. So it's a complex of three rather than the duality of old and new that was endorsed by Koolhaas. Well, this proposal was equally controversial. The building was considered as weird, dinosaur type of building, very eclectic, although some critics said it was adding to the eclectic aspect of Madison Avenue. Most of the critics didn't like it, and Koolhaas, just like Graves, had to go back to the drawing board and redesign the building. The second scheme is much more boring, I would say. It lacks the dinosaur excitement of the first one because they changed a number of criteria in the brief, and they said this time you can demolish the brownstones, and that's the reason why the brownstones are not integrated in this complex of three, but there's this block structure, boring block structure, which is added to the existing Breuer building. This proposal was equally unsuccessful, and after 2 years, which coincided in a way with my ethnographic observation in the office of Koolhaas, Koolhaas was out of the game. The second proposal failed. A year later, another architect was commissioned to design the extension of the Whitney Museum of American Art, and you're probably guessing who is this? Renzo Piano. This was the proposal of Renzo Piano, and we are in 2005 here. I already had enough data from my ethnographic observation after 2 years of living with the tribe, and I was thinking maybe I'll go to Renzo Piano and tell him, this is impossible. It's impossible to extend this building on Madison Avenue, but I didn't have enough time because the project only stayed for a year in his office, and then they entirely abandoned the idea of an extension. Later on, they decided to build a branch of the museum, and they commissioned Renzo Piano to design the new Whitney, which was completed in 2015, and you have probably seen it. It's in the Meatpacking District in New York. When I started following the design of the Whitney, and the different series of failures of the previous objects, the previous project, I was thinking, what is wrong about this building? What is wrong about this building that it provoked so many reactions, good and bad, at the time of its construction and at the time of the extension plans? What kind of actors gathered around this building? Because the building was never left alone, an object out there. There were always crowds of people, of different experts, of different people with relevant knowledge to the building there. How did they speak on behalf of the building? And how do they claim to represent the building, to have the voice that will better speak on its behalf. One way, of course, of answering this question is to deduce the Whitney's meaning from the mythologies of the 60s and the 80s, and then 2001, 2005, and look at the whole kind of trajectory of the building, because it was not possible any longer, especially for me and for the designers at OMA, to take just one picture of the Whitney and to show it and to say, this is the museum. This is the building. It was impossible to just reduce the building to one particular image of it. Let's say you are in front of the building and you take a picture and that's it. We had to take into account all these proposals for extending the Whitney, all the failures, and the whole trajectory of the object, the series of transformations of the object. Nevertheless, if we decide to write on this case, one particular story will be to reduce the meaning of every single Whitney, every single version of the Whitney, to the mythologies and the social and cultural context of the time. The 60s, the 80s, or 2001, 2005. So to explain a building like the Whitney in the sense of the mainstream social sciences means to produce a social explanation of its architectural projects or its design, and totally forget about its specificity, just explain it by projecting it to the 60s, to the 80s, or to today. In spite of the fact that the Whitney building has its own strengths and logics, which we can witness in the design process, it will be assumed by many historians and theorists that it just simply reflects the specificities and the challenges of the modern style with Breuer, or the postmodernism with Grave, or the hipper, super modernist style of Koolhaas. While architectural projects develop according to their own competitive logic, they will be commonly associated with the social context, with the cultural and political climate of these three periods of time. The extension plans will be interpreted as mirroring specific institutional developments, political decisions, or shifts in institutional politics. In spite of the fact that the three architects painstakingly struggle to answer clients' briefs and communities' concerns by a set of distinctive design moves, their designs will be said to pertain to differences in their individual creative approaches, backgrounds, styles, and visual languages. Even though the design process of extending the Whitney Museum unfolded according to its proper logic, as we can see here, architectural critics still try to explain the reasons for dismissing the Whitney project by referring to the chronic identity crisis of this cultural institution, or engage in causal explanations of the museum history. And this was everywhere at the time when I was working on the project. A comparative analysis of the figurative languages of the three architects of Whitney also cannot explain us why the Whitney fails, and it cannot explain the very long Whitney trajectory of failures. And it was a tempting thing to do. We have this little object, the Whitney, and the whole history of modern architecture there, of architecture there. We have modernism, postmodernism, and hypermodernism, an exciting story to write by simply looking at the object and the traces that different design projects have left on this object. Yet, entering the office of Koolhaas to learn about the ongoing process of design, I decided to follow architects in gaining knowledge about this building, and I literally followed them, becoming retrospective, while dealing retrospectively with architectural history, going back to the 80s and trying to understand the design moves and the design approach of Graves, trying to open the black box of the design of Graves, and then coming back, gaining some knowledge about his proposals and about the complexity of the design moves, and then coming back to the office in Rotterdam to integrate this knowledge in the process of design. And as well, and at the same time, going back to the 60s, trying to understand the design of Breuer, opening the black box of design of Breuer, gaining knowledge about this, and going back to Rotterdam. So this travels in history, back to history, by only revisiting very selectively the controversies and what happened and who were the actors involved and what were the constraints in design. It was a very selective way of architects to become historians, to revisit retrospectively this rich trajectory of controversy, this rich history of controversies. To gain access to the repertoire of actions of the Breuer and the Graves building, they studied very carefully some books on the building history, and they looked very carefully at what the building did in the 60s and in the 80s, and how it reacted to the attempts of architects and urban planners to extend it in a particular way, how various actors talked on behalf of the building. So instead of tracing this kind of linear history of architecture, which I could have done, of course, with this rich example, a linear history of architecture from Bauhaus to Koolhaas, based on comprehensive historical investigation, I embarked in the similar retrospective analysis of the past together with the designing architects, and engaged in a process of interpretation of the Whitney Museum and its performance by going back and recollecting that part of history, that part of historical interpretations that were relevant to the design in the office. So to understand the object, I had to unravel the whole history of design controversies, and I followed in particular the different constraints of the experimentation process. There were three main constraints at the time of this experimentation, which also shaped in a long term the design solutions. The first one was not to neglect the Breuer landmark, because the Breuer building was already a modernist icon, not to neglect and to design a building that is respectful to the Breuer. So that was the first important design requirement. The second was not to demolish the adjacent buildings, the historically valuable brownstones next to the Breuer. And the third one was not to exceed the zoning envelope. There were these three main conditions of the experimentation. So the experimentation with models was not a free experimentation in terms of interacting with the foam and trying to extract the shape that will be innovative, that will be groundbreaking, and that will be interesting for this project, but the experimentation happened within the limits of these three conditions, these three requirements of design. So the same not two requirements were in a way a spur to design in the offices of Breuer and Graves to different extent. I will not enter into the details. And they subsequently also shaped the design proposals. So what traveled in history were also some of these constraints, not just the building and the architects. So going back to history, to the time of Breuer and Graves, to see how Breuer and Graves responded to those design conditions and interpreted the Whitney, and then coming back to the office of Koolhaas in a kind of non-linear time way was the strategy of research. Recollecting the Whitney of Breuer and Graves against the recent design schemes of Koolhaas, I relied on the assumption shared by design architects that buildings are pragmatically knowable, not symbolic. If we look very quickly at a kind of cosmogram of the buildings of the Whitney from the three periods of time. Again, we see that the building is never on its own, but it's always surrounded by different actors. In the 60s, of course, we see Breuer and Smith, the architects. We see the architecture critics very active in this story, of course. New Yorkers, the Whitney family, because it was, the museum was founded as a by the Whitney family, the board of the trustees, but also the public is very active. Museum artists discussing gravitational laws are also a factor. In the 80s, we see even a larger crowd of actors around the building, around the three extension plans. Of course, the constellation of actors vary according to the plan, and some of the actors are the same that we have seen in the 60s, but there are more actors, like the sponsor of the extension proposals, Leonard Lauder. We have a big battle between modernists and preservationists related to the Breuer building. We have the museum professionals. The museum professionals and museum directors, they were into two different camps, and they were even asked to explain at social events why those who were full Graves extensions, they were asked to explain why they wanted to destroy the existing Breuer building. And we have institutional actors like the board of the estimate, the City Planning Commission, the Upper East Side Community Board, and so on. And some of the same actors appear also when we try to trace the complexity of the controversies in 2001 and 2004, when the project was in the office of Koolhaas. We see the board estimator, the City Planning Commission are still there, American art and the museum philosophy is largely discussed to the extent that they become actors in the story. The mayor of New York appears as an actor, artist and zoning law. So we see that as the controversy develops, we cannot any longer talk about a static object here. The controversies develop, and as the controversy developed, a bigger number of actors and resources were mobilized. Even actors that had nothing to say about design were there, and they had something to say about the Whitney. And also the local communities and the local connections among all those actors became more and more, more and more. So gaining more allies and critiques, letters of support and complaints and agitating different city groups, the Whitney building became a full-blown actor. The more people spoke against and in support of this building, the bigger the crowds of visitors and passers-by got. The more the resources and allies locally available increased, the more social did design become. So following the controversies and the many detours also in the architectural intentions to realize this extension, to extend the building, we do not see any longer just a static modernist object, a construction, an object out there on Madison Avenue, but we see the object plus its anticipated extensions presented as plans, plus a variety of actors that all disagree, they come from different worlds, they all disagree, they all have something to say about the building and on behalf of the building. So the object is never just there in a kind of neutral Euclidean space. We have the object plus the project plus all these actors and their discordant voices. The Whitney that looked like a very simple technical or aesthetic object at the start of this story, in the controversy, became socio-technical, socio-aesthetic, socio-political. From built once and forgotten in the 60s, it became potentially extendable. From taken for granted, it became contested. From immediate, mediated by many other projects and visuals. From rapid, it became slow. From a static object, reminiscent to a bird that does not fly, it became a bird in a fly, with the trajectorial nature that I have illustrated with a series of projects. We can see the traces of those different flights. Not an autonomous, emancipated, coherent, modernist object standing on Madison Avenue, but a complex ecology, a multiple object, which is how I visualize it, with this drawing of a student of mine, but the building is more than just the feature, the structural feature of the Whitney, but also the sum of connections, associations, and projections about potential extensions, plus the connections created in the design controversy. That's why we can talk about a multiple project and ecology. So every attempt to extend the building, to project a different extension, is a trial that makes us reconsider what a building is and how many ingredients it is made of. Precisely because design and architecture are accountable, and we cannot continue to argue any longer that buildings and architectural institutions are due to the diffracted presence of society. There is a society and social context out there that will explain us why the Whitney was made so in the 60s and why it was controversial in the 80s. We cannot consider this as an explanation. There are no social dimensions or factors of any sort explaining the success or the failures of this architectural project. Buildings are not simply projections or representations of the social. They could, however, become social, and we have seen this with the Whitney. We have witnessed this with a series of controversies. They can become social because they possess an immense capacity of connecting heterogeneous actors. Again, what we saw with the Whitney is that the bigger the number of actors and resources mobilized around the extension plans got, and the connections among those actors increased, the more social design became. This particular capacity of a building to associate all these different participants in design and in different periods of time makes it an important social actor. Here is the social, not outside the design. The social is in the process of mobilizing and mobilization and enrollment of all those participants rather than outside the design process, outside the controversies, explaining them. So, in conclusion, I argue that a building cannot be defined by what it is or what it means, and the Whitney is a perfect example for this. We cannot reduce the building to a number of structural or programmatic features or just its symbolic meaning. But a building can rather be defined by what it does, what kind of disputes it provokes, and how it resists to attempts of transformation in different periods of time. Such an understanding of buildings can bring more awareness of the ways architecture is made and how it takes part in the making of the social. In what follows, I would like just to show some slides of how I have taken this question in another project and in architectural education. How do we visualize a building that is not static, that we can not just represent in an Euclidean space, but that is something that is dynamic, that is moving? How do we visualize its agency, what it does, and how it triggers those different disagreements, and how it connects different type of participants in design? With this question in mind, we started looking at a recent controversy. At the time, it was an ongoing controversy. This was the controversy for the design of the Olympic Stadium in London. we started following this project from the very start. So we can witness how the design process unfolds, but also we can witness the different controversies in the process. And we follow it all the way through construction, the very controversial sculpture next to it, and until the final opening of the games. What we did is to trace this controversy, but there were so many protagonists in the controversies that it was almost untraceable on the basis of interviews and ethnographic observation only. And that's why we decided to trace the controversy so as to be able to map and visualize the agency of the building, of the London Stadium design as a complex ecology. From the start, and we compiled a list of actors, individual, institutional, and non-human actors. At the start, because the list of actors was very long, we decided to group them in these 3 different groups. All these actors were identified on the basis of media reports, press clippings. So this was the main source for us to map the controversy. Then we work with a team of 5 to read those articles, identify the actors, and the information was scripted and handed over to the designers to produce a mapping of the controversy. And by mapping here, we mean not mapping of the reality, but mapping as a tool of navigating a large pool of data, which we had at the time. In my field, in science studies, there were some attempts to visualize networks coming from the 90s, but you see how poor the visual language of these maps were at the time. So this is a map from the 90s. The advantage of these maps were that we have an overview of what is going on other sites of ethnography. We don't have to limit ourselves to one particular site of ethnography, but we draw connections with other sites, and this was the intention for developing this tool. This is a software called Résolu, developed in Paris, and then there was another one with GovCom, developed in Amsterdam. Again, these were useful tools in the 90s, but we thought perhaps with the recent developments in parametrics and in architectural, the BIM modeling, for instance, and other tools in architectural design, we can use some of this intelligence, some of these tools from the design, and bring them back in social sciences to understand and to be able to visualize the complexity of social phenomena. What was here for us interesting is that not just these images were difficult to read, well, not as difficult as the Résolu maps because they're absolutely impossible to read. We only read number of clusters, but here what was difficult is the limited visual language of the map. As soon as we talk about an actor or a participant in design, we draw a dot. As soon as we talk about connection, we draw a line. And that was it. The maps were static, they were difficult to read, and the visual language was very limiting. So then we started a dialogue with computational designers, and the very first attempt to visualize the controversies surrounding the London Olympics was this little animation. So this is a couple of minutes animation produced with BIM. And what we see here is a number of actors participating in the controversy, and it's dynamic. But still the visual language is very static. We have basically dots and lines dancing on the screen, always according to the same scenario, so it's predictable. And we have a flashing timeline on the top, which tells us at which moment in time the actors are concerned by legacy, for instance, or they are concerned by the cost of the Olympic Stadium design. Then we said we need something more sophisticated that will give justice to the method, to the actor network theory method. And we started looking at artists, and we looked at the work of Sarah Cheno, who was at the Biennale that year, and the flexible nets of Sarah Cheno, which inspired our designers from AEDAS London, the Research and Development Department of AEDAS, to produce a visualization, which I'll run in a second. But here the idea was to accommodate more actors, as all the actors that take part in the design of the Olympics, to also, do we have this? Yeah. To also give equal weight to all the actors, and that is the reason for having a gray structure. So we don't know who are the important actors and actors at the start, and the idea was to also illustrate that an actor gains an identity in the controversy as it connects to others. So even Boris Johnson is not Boris Johnson, but this is the Boris Johnson that has something to say about the Olympics, and because he has something to say about legacy, he becomes more and more people group around him, and he gains weight in this mapping. We have the different concerns unlisted: design, legacy, design, bid, cost, and you can switch them all off as well, so you can decide to follow only those actors who have been concerned with legacy and planning, for instance, and you can isolate one part of the network and decide to follow this part of the network. You can, of course, add color on it to designate these bigger groupings. You can also connect it to primary sources, so all the articles on the basis of which the mapping was produced are there as primary sources, and with a double click, you can go back to the primary source and actually read what a particular actor in the controversy has said about the design. And you can also look at the image and at the status of the development of the design project at the time when a particular statement was made. So with a double click, we have the connection from the overview to the primary sources, secondary and primary sources. We also have, you can see it more clearly here, and here with the connection to the design. We also have a foldable time, which I will show in a minute. Here, we're in a very Deleuzian, sorry, we're not in another type of time. The time is foldable, and it goes back and forth, and you can literally follow the networks as they develop, and you can follow it also with different speeds. I'll show this in a minute. Of course, not everything can fit on a screen, and we have done experiments with the same methods to map another controversy, which in this case was unmappable. This was the debate surrounding the high-speed train project, the HS2 project in the UK. We decided to follow it, and the data was so much, and there were so many concerns and so many actors that it was impossible to fit them in a screen and make sense of this data. And this method was also then taken into architectural education, where I asked my students to choose a particular controversy and then map it by looking at the actors, the timeline, produce actorial diagrams to show the relationships among the actors and their specific statements, trace the change of those statements in space and time, and how they connect to the particular form of the building, to the particular shape of the building. And they produced, at the end of this project, they produced websites in Manchester and interactive diagrams in Princeton. So this was also an interesting way for architecture students to engage with what we call agency of the building, but also to try to use the visual skills they have as good designers. At the end of year 3, they're already good designers. At MARC level, they're brilliant designers. To use the visual skills they have in hand to visualize not what a building is and what it can symbolically mean, but what a building does and all the different controversies and debates a building can trigger. Thank you.
As Michael mentioned in his introductions, Albena and I have something important in common, which is that we're both deeply indebted to Bruno Latour as an intellectual model. I'm probably a bit more of a heretic now, seeing that Latour hates my second most recent book, Immaterialism. I don't think he would hate any of this. I think, in fact, Albena and Bruno wrote an important article together, Give Me a Gun and I Will, what's the exact title?
I'll make all buildings move.
I'll Make All Buildings Move.
The gun is the end here.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there they are talking about buildings as projects that are not ready-made buildings, but buildings in the making, where you have to follow all the actors that go into constructing the building and all the possible later uses that come out of it. And I can't imagine a better incarnation of a Latourian architecture theory than you gave today and in all your articles that I've read. So it's very nicely done. Now, I think here's where I disagree. That's fine. You already know about our disagreement.
We're here to disagree.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a problem, and I'll state the problem this way. And you heard this at Yale, I think, last week. There are two kinds of knowledge in the world, only two. When somebody asks you about what something is, you can tell them what it's made of, or you can tell them what it does. I think those are the only two kinds of knowledge that exist, and we need knowledge. But knowledge does not exhaust the sum of cognitive activity. Aesthetic experience, for example, is not a knowledge, as Kant showed. You cannot paraphrase an artwork, or I would say a building, in terms of knowledge, either in terms of the actors that went to make it up, or even the physical components that went to make it up, or the effects that it has, because it's deeper than its effects and it's higher than its components. And so I would say what you miss I call these two things undermining and overmining. You're undermining a thing when you talk about what it's made of, and the problem there is you can't really explain emergence, because if you just talk about the pieces that come together, you can't talk about what more the finished product has that isn't in all the pieces coming together. And when you think a thing only in terms of its effects, which is very popular in philosophy these days, you're losing the ability to explain change. And this goes all the way back to Aristotle, who in the Metaphysics is arguing with the Megarians, his rivals near Athens, who said someone's only a house builder, ironically for architects, someone's only a house builder if they're actually building houses right now. And so if you're a sleeping master house builder, you're not a house builder. And Aristotle notices the bizarreness of this, and he has to introduce the concept of potentiality in order to explain that the sleeping master house builder has the potential because of the knowledge and the expertise that simply aren't being expressed or actualized right now. And to link this to what we were doing earlier today when we were looking at the design contest winners, what I'm bothered by in a lot of design today, as I mentioned to my fellows on the tour, is that a lot of times people to explain the form will simply explain how it was generated. They'll say, we took the negative space around a tornado and turned it into four forms, which here they are. But doing that doesn't really account for the form. It explains how it was generated, but a form is not just how it was generated. And I think this might have been what Peter Eisenman had in mind when he told you an archive is unimportant for architecture. I agree with you, it is important, but what he's talking about is generating forms.
Yeah, after the fact. Yeah, there is a big importance when you talk about generating form, thinking about the generation of form when you do it, or after you have done it. After you have done it, they always say this. But if you follow them without questioning what they think, if you just follow them, how they produce a shape, and you see the shape emerging in front of their eyes, and they don't even verbalize it as well. The form of the building is there. That's another way of talking about aesthetic experience as well, and what this model does to the architect, and that the shape is indeed there. But they will realize this in 10 days, in 2 weeks, when the building is already fixed, and they will present it as a project, and they will tell the whole story about how form was generated.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to make 2 more points, and then I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, yeah, sorry.
One of the points is going to, again, repeat what I said on the tour this morning, which is, as a newcomer to architecture, as a philosopher who's lately become associated with architecture schools, I come across a lot of forms that seem generated too easily from parametric design software and 3D printers. You can design any kind of crazy form by just plugging in the right parameters, and you end up with some very futuristic-looking, melting star shape with things pointing in all directions. But you look at that and you might think it's cool, but then you can't remember it an hour later. You can't really remember what it looked like. Whereas I think at least a lot of the designs that capture the imaginations of the public are memorable. And I mentioned the Sydney Opera House, which is a popular favorite. I'm not sure to what extent architects hold it in high esteem still, but tourists love it, and it doesn't seem dumbed down for the tourist. It seems like it has some aesthetic merit. And there you have just an unusual distribution of fairly familiar forms, hemispheres. And that's what makes it memorable. Or the Eiffel Tower, which I've heard architects rip, actually, as pure engineering and bad design. But Sydney Opera House. Okay, so that's one thing. The forms seems to need something apart from the conditions of its generation. And I was going to bring Kant into this, since Kant is still the dominant voice in aesthetic theory. What Kant's all about is, he doesn't call it formalism in the Critique of Judgment, but it is formalism. It's formalism in the sense that aesthetics should not have any agreeableness to it. It should not be for any ulterior purpose. The form is self-contained, and he doesn't talk about ignoring the actors that gave rise to it, but that's implicit, I think, in Kant's discussion, that Kant would not like a discussion of a building like this, I don't think. He'd want to talk about just the final form of the building and not care about the processes that generated it. And so if you're embracing this way of approaching architecture, you're embracing a different kind of non-formalist approach to aesthetics, which puts you on the side of other non-formalist schools, such as in literature, the new historicists, right, who tried to get away from the formalism of the literary text and talk about the social political context in which Shakespeare's plays were generated. Or in the case of the visual arts, the art in the 60s that opposed Greenberg's sort of formalism came in contact with pop and minimalism and performance art and conceptual art, and even Dada to some extent. So you're aligning yourself with this whole other tradition that is opposed to formalism, and that's fine because there are problems with formalism, but there's also something powerful about it, which is the idea that the aesthetic experience, like the ethical experience for Kant, is self-contained and has no ulterior purposes. So how much are you willing to embrace that?
Thank you, Graham. I'll start with the knowledge generation question because I slightly disagree with you that there's no knowledge generation in architecture or in architectural design. And Jorge reminded me this in his talk because he was talking about working with pollution, not representing pollution, not acting against pollution, but working with pollution. And in this process of working with, in the design processes I followed, this is expressed in different ways. With the Whitney case, the designers had to work with all those constraints that were inherited or limitations in the design experiments, which were inherited in history, and some of those constraints were stable and there, and others were not that fixed, and they could be changed, like the brownstones. One. For a couple of years it was constrained, and then they said, well, for 1 year it was a constraint, and then they said you can actually demolish the brownstone, and then the brownstones, and then the whole process of working with those constraints and those limitations that have an impact on the design experimentation is an extremely interesting way of engaging with the architectural object, and I would agree with you, there is some kind of aesthetic experience there. There is a moment when the model in this particular office, it's the model. The models incorporate this aesthetic experience. The models talk back to the architect talks with, interacts with the foam and talks to the model, and also hopes that in this dialogue with the models and with the foam, they will learn something about the building and about how to find the solution to those constraints, to those limitations in design in the best possible way. Or, as Koolhaas would say, how to design a smart building. And a smart building for him would not be a beautiful building. There will be no degree of aesthetic experience there. It will be the building that will solve all these problems in a smart way, that will be respectful to the broiler, that will fill the zoning envelope without exceeding it, that will integrate the brownstones, and will repair all the damages that have been made on this particular site, and will make up for all the mistakes of the previous designers. But at the same time will be a building that we can live with, nothing more, nothing beautiful. And that's why they all disliked it and called it dinosaur, weird shape. And I can't even say I like the building, but because I follow the whole process and how attached the architects were to this particular building because for them, the building solved all the problems in an intelligent way and became this intelligent creature which is there and will never produce aesthetic experience to any of the viewers or the users, but was a quasi-aesthetic object for them, for the architects. And of course, it started as a piece of model. And there is something enigmatic. I would agree with you on this. There's something enigmatic in design process. We cannot entirely describe design processes as a linear step of knowledge production either. Yeah, there are all those surprises, all those oop moments or ow moments of the designer and surprises by the object that we have in our hands in the process of cutting or in the process of pure experimentation of taking a piece of foam and a can of Coca-Cola and playing with them, and then of course thinking about the object we have and the kind of design brief that we have to solve, and then something comes out of this playing with materials and shapes, and oop, the building is there. We don't see the shape, we don't even know what's going there, we just follow, it's again like we follow the architects in a kind of strange dance, strange trance, holding a piece of foam and dancing in the office, or holding it and looking at it and dancing it. And there's some kind of aesthetic experience there, yeah, which we rarely account when we talk about design process. So maybe with this we need this kind of surplus.
And I didn't mean to say that the final product is always better. In fact, in this case, I didn't know most of this story, and I thought you told it wonderfully. And yet I still hate the new Whitney, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe architects can tell me why I'm wrong, but I can't stand it.
No,
It
it's
tells
terrible.
me. I don't want
Oh
to
yeah,
go in.
I hate it too, yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's a disaster. You mean the Renzo piano with me?
the one that's open now on the west
Yeah,
side.
You don't like the cattle experience of
No.
the...
No, I don't.
Yeah.
And so I was just going to say, so I still think that just points to the fact that there's a difference between the form and the process that gave rise to it, because the process in this case is better. In some cases, it might be less interesting, but
Exactly, yeah.
here it's more interesting, I think.
But again, I think we think about form and conceptualize form when this process is invisible, and most of the time this process is invisible. How often do we connect the process of design and the series of experimentation and experimental drawings that an architect has produced with the final building? Yeah, but not in design history and theory. Yeah, some historians do it. But again, after the fact, after 20 years, or I don't know, 50 years, they find this archive, but the archive has limitations as well, because in the archive there are a certain number of drawings kept, a certain number of data kept. Instead of waiting for an architect to wait, I just would go in architectural practices now and see what is happening. So this is a different way also of approaching aesthetic experience, not just standing in front of a building, trying to interact or contemplate it, whatever the modalities of experience is there, but trying to connect it with the design experience or the design steps of knowledge that have resulted, and connecting those experiments and with the design product is another way that could help us engage with the architecture object in a kind of non-formalist way, because we'll not be thinking even about the form any longer. We'll be thinking, I often think those, especially when I see a building of Koolhaas, this weird thing that I see on the top, this must have been a piece of foam taken from that particular part or from another project, which ended accidentally on another model, and that's how it found itself here. I'll not think, what does this represent? Or I would not stand in front of an object, this object, and try to contemplate its form to generate, to expect some kind of aesthetic experience. At one point, when you start to explain to the general audience what they actually meant, it takes a little bit of the strangeness of that object being created out of the process of doing it. Everybody knew exactly the process we would see, but there's no exploration. Do we really know about the process when we see a building? And we also don't know everything about the history, yeah. And to what extent the history and the series of failures in this particular
And architecture
case.
is an art. It's a different, there's a different reason why one makes architecture as one makes a work of art. The mystery has to be in the public realm. You have to live with a building. You can't just ignore it. Whereas you don't have to go see a work of art.
Yeah, I've been frantically scribbling notes into coherence here because you and Graham you had a handicap. You had already worked some of this out beforehand, so I feel as though I'm at a disadvantage, and I should get some special consideration in my comments. So as someone who just published this book on constraint and play in ordinary life, I've been thinking a lot about this concept of constraint more generally, as a general concept. And obviously we know it well, in the arts and design. It's something we talk about all the time. And one of the quips or quotes about constraint that's made the rounds again recently, and that I've sort of pulled up here on my phone, is this excerpt from a Charles Eames interview from the early 70s, in which Eames says, well, what is the design process? Oh, it's process of working under constraint. And then the follow-up question is, well, what kind of constraints? And Eames says the sum of all constraints. Here is one of the few effective keys to the design problem, the ability of the designer to recognize as many of the constraints as possible, his willingness and enthusiasm for working within these constraints of price, of size, of strength, of balance, of surface, of time, and so forth. Each problem has its own peculiar list. And this is like, yeah, so totally, right? Like, we're all just like, but in practice, it seems to me, and I'm thinking about design more broadly here. In practice, just the opposite seems to take place. Design has become a discipline or a family of disciplines of seeking to overcome constraint rather than to embrace them. And even the way that design itself as a bare word has now kind of left all its other contexts, and we talk about design as though it exists abstractly, or even we translate it into other domains. Like there's this concept of design thinking, which is, this is a great way to sell your ideas back to the universe. Is just like take your discipline and then strap on a word like thinking, and then you've got your whole career made for you there. In which externality and disruption and entropy, these become, the kind of values. We'll throw designers into what do you got a problem? I've got a designer. We'll mess with it. We'll mess it all up. Which is rather the opposite of that notion of the constraints and all of the constraints, and the more the better, structuring not just the circumstances, but the thing itself. And to me, as an aside, this is why play is an important and useful concept, because play is this process of working with materials. Like the play is in the play that's in a mechanism, rather than as a synonym for freedom of doing what you want. Anyway, what's the point as it relates to your presentation? I was, kind of thinking about, and I knew the concerns that Graham would have intuitively, even if I hadn't heard them before, just from having kind of seen this conflict between actor network theory and O already. But seeing the network diagrams of the different actors and the forces that they're exerting on the problem space made it somewhat clearer to me that it seems like it's that network model makes it harder, I think, I'm positing, I'm questioning, I'm wondering, does it make it harder to see the way that all of those constraints make a thing what it is, rather than demonstrating what it does or what forces are impacting it or what other actors it is impacting? And, if you think of design as a process of making, and this is just an idea, of design as a process of making something even more what it is, then that sort of exploded view of the network diagram always takes us somewhere else. And I wonder what the opposite would be, the sort of imploded view, where we see, the results of the constraining effects on the resultant object, whether that's the resultant design object or whether it's something else. And I think this is, somewhat related to Graham's concern or comment about the visibility of, which is kind of my summary of your critique of the 3D objects, 3D printed objects, the visibility of those effects, right? Because what they are is not just the list of effects, but the sum total exertion of those forces on the resultant object, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. Those are great questions. The constraints and the conditions in design process, I cannot think of a design process, not just in architecture, but in design, that has no constraints and no limitations. Otherwise, we're in the regime of producing anything on the 3D printer. But a building has to stand, has to endure at least for a certain number of years. There's a number of basic constraints which are there and which are probably implicit because designers know what they're doing. And there's a number of constraints or conditions or limitations coming from the brief. And you'll know better than me how these limitations or conditions could play a creative role, could be creatively interpreted, or could be kind of creative conditions, I would say, of this experimentation process. Because at the beginning I was also thinking, like Graham was saying, we can do endless form shaping with all this kind of new digital tools. And I was thinking, okay, it could be anything that we could do with foam. And then I had also long interviews with the architects and long observations of the model making workshop and how they engage with the foam and the materiality of the foam and to what extent this particular material helps them to think differently about a building and helps also foam generation differently. And they were telling me a lot that they think differently about form if they work with wood or if they work with cardboard or the other material. So it's not just the material a model is produced by is not a neutral kind of medium. The material itself also brings conditions and limitations and constraints, so to say. And it's in this dialogue between the conditions and the constraints brought by the materiality of the medium that helps architects to think and generate form, and those constraints that come from the brief and the clients and the many other contextual, including historical limitations and constraints, that will see a new design emerge. So it's indeed much more complex, and we cannot talk about the limited number of conditions or constraints, but it's equally not, it's not a free experimentation. It's not a free form generation, and design is never totally free. The network diagram contains concerns, and it's a shame I cannot show it because on the, it has.
There it is.
Yeah, but I can't run it for some reason. It shows University of Texas. Yeah, maybe I need a password or something. Can you do it?
That could be the constraint.
Right.
There was one big one.
Yeah.
But there is a difference between concerns. These are concerns of different groups participating in the controversies who have a different take on the controversy, a different things to say. Yeah, but I don't see it here.
Is there a play button?
Can you do reset, maybe? Yeah, if you do reset. Some of those concerns, so for instance, they're concerned that the building will not have any life after the games, and this was the main concern. They were not that much concerned about the iconic shape of the stadium, because all buildings have to be iconic, and of course, they were, and especially stadia, are usually iconic, and they were thinking about the Beijing Stadium and comparing the Beijing Stadium, which is the reason why Beijing appears as one of the actors, as something that matters. So the actor is something that makes a difference in the configuration of relationships. Anyway, I can't move it. But, well, you get the idea. So we have the numbers of actors enlisted here, and then we have the different concerns of those actors based on careful reading of the media reports and everything written at the time. And we have this foldable time, and time runs with different speeds, and we can literally, well, this is kind of inspired by the Monads, this visualization. Then we have another inspired by Saraceno's networks, where you can literally see how a particular concern of the actors taking part in this debate gains importance. So some of those concerns become constraints, and they became
Sure. Yeah, no, I understand.
And because we were following how the whole debate unfolds, it was difficult to say, well, this will be a constraint in the design process, or this will not be a constraint in the design process. But some of those concerns of different actors were then taken by Peter Cook and Hawk Sports and incorporated in the design process. Especially the legacy issue was very much, the interpretation of legacy is something that was very much reflected in the final design, and also security issues, which appear towards the end of the whole controversy.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting and useful tool. I'm not so much wondering if it's the wrong tool as I am trying to imagine what the opposite version of this kind of visualization would be, right?
Yeah.
You know, that shows the result or the impact, for example, of the constraint of reuse on the resulting object.
Yeah.
Just as a kind of off the top of my head example.
The idea behind, word. The idea behind was to show not just one particular voice in the story, but to show all the different positions at the same time, and the complexity of the becoming Olympics of London, which was at stake at the time. It was not just about the stadium, it was not just about the designer. I could have gone to the designer's office and made a series of interviews with the designer, and I can just talk about the designer's position. I could have gone to Johnson, and I could speak about the mayoral politics of Boris Johnson. So that's another story. But none of those stories will show the complexity of this debate from different points of view. And when we showed this to different protagonists in the debate, they were able to see themselves, and they were even surprised. So I was here, but then I disappeared. Why I'm here as an architect, and why I'm here as my practice name. And this was, in a way, again, like a huge model that, again, talks back to all those participants in the process and presents them with different views from the world of the controversy, not outside of it. Yeah.
Thanks, Albena. I very much enjoyed the presentation. I just want to say as an aside that I have an architecture and design firm, and we've had 3 anthropologists in our office over 25 years. Interestingly, and by some strange coincidence, they were all women, and the very first one came from Manchester, so I guess there's some sort of anthropology architecture link there. It was a very interesting process. I was wondering why, I kept wondering why there were so many anthropologists calling us up, like Papua New Guinea is all finished, and so the architects are the new tribe that we have to look at, you know.
Not the only tribe, not the only modern tribe.
Fieldwork is more comfortable.
Yeah. Yes, we have better coffee. But one of the things I did notice was, and as you mentioned in your presentation, it was very quick to suddenly ask, you turn into the Stockholm Syndrome, which is you start to connect with your captors. So we were having our anthropologists building models for us, because that's just the way we do things. And likewise, afterwards, in the last one, wrote a book, so you can actually go see. It's called Idea Works. And they wrote a book about the process in our office.
Yeah,
one of the things I noticed was about the book was that it influenced us greatly, and so actually we drew from that book and have now incorporated many of the comments that they had into our process. And likewise, I think the anthropologists saw something new. So I would say thank you very much for being an anthropologist, even though you're so very frustrating anthropologist, because you can never ask a question. They always answer with another question. It's impossible to get an answer, but interesting, and I like it. And I would say that I definitely agree with you that there are a great many actors in the process, and they tend to be ignored or overlooked. And I would urge you to spread your message to the architectural critics, because there's a tremendous focus on architectural criticism dealing primarily with form. And I would like to expand on what Graham said. Yes, form is of course important, but a monument, any kind of monument, can be remembered in different ways. Traditionally, architecture was representing itself as sculptural monumentality. In other words, a thing that you could identify with when you looked at it. But other projects, like we made the opera in Oslo in Norway, and most people can't tell you what it looks like, but everyone can tell you what they did there. So it's a social monument as opposed to a sculptural one, and people enjoy having these social moments on the building, all the way to having sex on the roof of the building, so that it's some kind of a monument.
Brilliant building, by the way. It's one of my favorites.
Thanks, appreciate it. But this brings me to another project I made, which I would like to extend on, maybe offer some information. We recently finished the expansion of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, which is a tripling of the size of a very iconic, monumental, postmodernist building, that the most identifiable Mario Botta building in North America. And one of the things I learned is that museums are essentially, and you probably knew this, but it sort of bubbles to the surface when you think about it more, is that a museum, in addition to being a cultural machine, it's an economic machine, it's a money-making machine. They have to, in America, since they're not subsidized by governments or otherwise, you have to constantly think about economic sustainability. Museums do this in a number of ways. One of the ways they do it is they use their building as an identifiable branding object. So they plaster, and they want buildings that they can put on their logos and on their tickets and everything. And in fact, it's so extreme that when we made the design for that building, when we were contracted, we had to do what's called work for hire, where you sign away all characteristics of the identity of that building to the owner, so that if we ever wanted to do another museum expansion somewhere else, even if it was a Mario Botta building, we couldn't use any of the identifiable characteristics on that next building. They own the way it looks. Yeah. It's really interesting. And it's difficult to change that. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that way of thinking turns buildings into fetishes, like these fetishes that you might find in an anthropological study in New Guinea. They tend to have these mysterious qualities because they're so fetishized by what they can do. And so this leads to the choice of architect. In the New Whitney project, it wasn't really a competition. It was done sort of old school style. Each one of those steps was like, let's see what the zeitgeist is. I'm the director of the museum. This person's pretty popular, and they're pretty cool too. So let's get them in to do the job. And in the end, you have a very, very strange, weird process based on the selection of an architect by someone who sort of knows about architecture, but not enough to really understand its complexities. There's nobody out there like you telling them how complex it is. And they know that this person gets published a lot and is going to give them a fetish that's going to make a lot of money. Well, of course, the public reacts negatively to that because this is a kind of greed. And they're looking for generosity. And generosity is a big part of what cultural buildings have to do. So in SF MoMA, they had a competition where they really had an open competition. We probably would have never gotten that job if it was done by the zeitgeist method. Yeah. But we won on how we work and what we do. And then furthermore, the clients of the building did something very generous. They built a fire station. The first new fire station in San Francisco in like 100 years, to be generous. As soon as you do that, everybody's like, oh, a fire station, how wonderful. Well, we love your architect. So, I think there are ways to work within the system. So I'd like to just add my question. Is the lesson of what you're trying to say that we should fight against all of these actors that are participating in the process, or should we work with these actors? Some people would say that architecture is being destroyed by all of this complexity and all these actors. That some are saying that working with them is good, like form follows junction, right?
Yeah, thank you. That was a very rich set of comments. I will start with the question, perhaps. Shall we? I think it's important to have the awareness that all these actors are there, which is difficult to have, especially when you are in the middle of the design process and you don't know who else is there looking at you, waiting for your design to be there, and who is reacting to this design. And this network diagram, which of course can be criticized a lot, but at least it can help us to understand that the designer is not on his own in his practice, in a dialogue with a drawing or a model, trying to generate a shape, but there are many other voices, and indeed the economic constraints are there, and indeed political constraints are there, and historical, inherited historical constraints are there, but many other actors or other participants in design that we don't expect to be there are still there. And they have and they wait for your design, and they have something to say, and they are concerned by the design, and they expect it to be there. So I think this awareness, not just of the complexity, which is a word we use a lot now, or the multiplicity, but this awareness of the manyness, the many different voices.
We call it simplexity.
Yeah, many different voices that are there in the design process is the first thing we have to start with. And it's not always there. It's not always there. And sometimes we don't see it precisely because we are in the middle of the process and we cannot overlook, we cannot have an outside view. This is something that my students always tell me when at the end of a mapping of a controversy, they always tell me, oh, we didn't expect the land owners to be there. We didn't expect to deal with ecologists in this project, but they were there because when they start mapping and unraveling the complexity of a debate, they find all those different other entities or other type of participants in a design process that they will never expect to see in a design project, or at least because they don't have the experience you have. They imagine a different kind of, it's almost like a reality check for them to engage in a mapping. And of course, the commission and the competition are different formats that trigger a completely different process. I agree with you. And of course, the economic constraints are there, and not they're just there, but they also change, the budget change. Sometimes the client, instead of saying, I don't like this building because it's weird, will say, I don't have the budget for this building, and then a lot of other constraints and concerns, aesthetic or political, are translated into economic concerns. And the economic concerns and constraints shape the design project as well, and I have seen this in many other cases in the Marina Bay project of Moshe Safdie, which I followed for a while, Birmingham train station, the design of the new street station in Birmingham with FOA office and other
Did you watch the BBC television series 2012? Oh my God, that is the funniest thing, man. And it's basically taking your diagram and making a TV comedy series out of it. It was about the building of the Olympics. It almost does as much as any other show to uncover the process.
I'd rather just listen to you guys riff. I'm really just here to listen. I guess I would say your account of that decades-long hassle of the Whitney was totally horrifying. And I kind of sympathize with the neighbors and the New Yorkers who, I mean, sometimes it seems like architecture is this hermetically sealed off kind of exercise in vanity of someone just kind of jacking off onto the neighborhood. And I appreciate what Craig is saying, that you can't approach it that way. But
it's more and more hermetically sealed now, I think, than recent past, but it has a history of being sealed off because traditionally architecture in the deep past, you had to be very wealthy to afford such things. Now it's a little more accessible to the world, but it still means that that many architects try to separate themselves from. I think the tradition is there to separate yourself and be this kind of I'm going to fix patriarch. Yeah.
Or he's trying to get in.
Okay, Jorge, and then I'd like to add something too. Go ahead.
Well, in the Whitney project, I discovered the controversies. They were there. They were there. I started looking at the object, and that's this table of models, and then this biography, rich biography of the object came to me. I was not looking for controversial knowledge or for controversial projects. They were just there, and because they constantly came back to the design process, those controversies from the 80s and from the 60s constantly came back to the model making shop, to the discussions among architects and value engineers. I had to consider them. I had to take them seriously as traces of this history, but also as the kind of knowledge that the designers were bringing back by revisiting the design in the 60s and in the 80s. In this other project, I look at controversies explicitly because controversy presents this kind of unstable architectural knowledge. Of course, this comes from science studies and the studies of science and technology controversies, but here, all the controversies and debates we have, and I have asked my students to map, are usually controversies around certain uncertainty, around a certain type of knowledge or type of design expertise which is not decided. What kind of shape this building will have, or how can we accommodate ecological concerns on this particular site, or how can we extend the Heathrow airport without demolishing the houses and without breaching the law, or how can we, with the Olympics design case, how can we design an object that will have a life after that and will not be just used for the event of the Olympics, but how can we design it with this idea of afterlife? There's always a question there that is quasi-scientific, that is quasi-experimental, and there's some kind of piece of contested knowledge there. And that's why I was interested in looking at controversies explicitly and asking the students to map them. Usually recent controversies, on controversies which are almost closed because there is usually more information, or almost like an archive, that we can get access to. If the controversy is too alive, if it's ongoing, it's extremely difficult to make sense of it, like the high-speed train controversy, the HS2 controversy in the UK, which was almost impossible to map because there were so many uncertainties, there are so many questions and so many concerns that it was impossible to make sense of this data. That's another, of course, another interest in controversy.
Jorge, isn't all architecture some kind of controversy? I mean, I don't know of any that's not in some way. Even if you're doing a private home, you know, people get divorced over the design. There's some, I mean, you're always, it's a big challenge.
Some architects say that they design with the idea of avoiding controversies. They think carefully at the what-if question, or what Graham
That's
will
how we
call
enter marriage.
a counterfactual question is that
what
what if
happens
I do this,
Right.
and how do I avoid this to become controversial? So the controversy is there, but maybe not that explicit in the architectural discourse or in the design project.
I wonder if you'd comment on two things. One of the slides that stayed up for quite a while was the diagonal slide showing all the projects.
Yeah.
At the different dates. And I couldn't help but notice that Renzo Piano's solution on a completely different site had a lot of similarities to all the other solutions. Well, surely it didn't have to do that. It's a bilateral solution. It has a wall or divider down the middle. It has the dinosaur head at the top right. It steps back on the top left like Breuer's steps forward. It has a large window to the right, which comes right out of Michael Graves's. Yeah. I mean, in a strange way, that building and the controversy itself, I think, has entered Renzo Piano's mind and re-emerges at the level of the formal, almost in spite of himself. I can't help but think that. So that's one observation. I don't know what to make of it. The other reminds me of an earlier life that I had when I was terribly interested in cyberspace and reading and writing about William Gibson's work And the fascination of the idea that behind everything you see, coursing along our telephone lines and cables and airwaves, is a digital, or at least an informational, alter universe to the one that we look at now, and that you would have to like jack into. Some wires in your brain, VR headset, but that you, once you got into that, you would actually see another world, which was the world of all the data flowing like, I think he called it black rain. And that launched a huge, almost industry in data visualization. And the idea was to try to inhabit or negotiate information in the raw that was being generated like chemicals from banks. Every single institution was like pouring information, molecules, gales of information from itself. He never quite specified how that was going to be visualized, or what it was. And people spent a decade more trying to find the form that was intrinsic in the data that was flowing around. It was quite common to see dot and line diagrams like you have, even ones that moved around. But they never seemed quite as fantastic as the ones Gibson could describe verbally, which were more like burning planets. And, you know, with the air, or the air thick with particles, with sort of beams shooting around all over the place. It was so hard to sort of to say that the world itself generated that is a found object. We just haven't found how to look at it, but it's an object that's already there. And the moment when you start designing it and going, okay, we're going to start with a dot and we're going to join it to another line, put a label on it, and some of the labels are nouns, some of them are people, some of them are processes, some of them are institutions. I actually despaired eventually of having a self-illustrating dataverse that one could negotiate. So I'm just wondering about your experience at getting the visualization going.
Yeah, on the new Whitney, I agree with you. Yeah, there is some kind of collage of the different approaches, and perhaps some kind of learning also from the previous schemes and the previous failures to extend it. And it's on a new site. It's amazing we have a tabula rasa situation. We don't have the same constraints, and nevertheless, some of the solutions are similar. So it's a shame. It's a pity, of course. I have seen the museum many times. I never dared entering. Yeah, I'm just scared. Yeah, because I lived with the Whitney for such a long time, that with the new Whitney. And the old Whitney is just a deserted site. It's like a ruin, which is a shame.
No, it's being used now.
Yeah, for other purposes.
And they just redid the restaurant downstairs, I think, which is...
With the sculpture gallery, yeah. As far as the visualization is concerned, we had a long discussion with designers, with computational designers. It took us 2 years to produce to go through different sets of visualizations. They had to go through a crash course in actor network theory, our designers, because we wanted to produce something that was not produced before, but parametrics was not enough here. They had to use some post-parametric applications. They had to adapt them to what we wanted to visualize. And the initial idea was also to connect this visualization with real-time browsers. And this was, they reassured me this was possible at the very start, to the extent that every time someone says something about the Olympics and it's online, it gets into our map and it reconfigures the different concerns and the different weight of the concerns in the debate, but at the end it was not possible, so we just ended here. It's never been done, yeah. No, yeah. So this was one of the limitations, and of course it can be interpreted now as a databasis of this process. Different researchers in my field have tried to use similar visualizations, this model, but insert interviews or ethnographic data instead of the media reports to see also the relational links between different actors, not just follow on a series of interviews or on data in one particular site or in one particular context, and it has been used in different ways. Yeah, but it's also part of a larger project, Mapping Controversies by Bruno Latour.